Today I'm going to show you how to throw a bowl. We're going to use our bucket of water filled to almost the top, a sponge, I'll use my wire tool, a needle tool, a wooden knife, and a rubber rib, a blue rubber rib. We have different ribs in the studio, a wooden rib, a metal rib, a serrated metal rib, but for the bowl we're going to use a rubber rib because it's bendable and flexible. And then I have my clay. So this is about not quite 2 pounds of clay, which is a good amount after shrinkage for something like the size of a cereal bowl. So if you've felt like you did pretty well with the cylinders, you can start to use a little bit more clay, maybe half a pound at a time. So for the bowls, maybe 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds, something like that. So turn my wheel on, and I'm going to take my piece of clay and not just set it down in the center, because when the wheel spins it will roll off, but I'm going to take it and smack it down in the center so it's nice and stuck. The first step to everything that we make on the wheel is called centering. Centering's the most important step. You can't make anything well without it being centered. And generally centering's the tricky part, where it takes people a while to grasp how to center something. I want to make sure I'm sitting as close to the wheel as possible, no space between the splash pan and me, and I'm leaning over the wheel. I'm not back here like this. You don't have to be strong to throw on the wheel, but you do have to use your body as leverage and your body weight. So I'm going to gradually get the wheel spinning as fast as I'm comfortable. That's usually a medium speed or faster. Eventually you'll probably center it at about top speed. My hands should always be nice and wet. And I'm going to start by pushing in with my left hand and down with my right hand, the same as with the cylinders. Gradually getting this up to as fast as I'm comfortable. For centering, I usually have it at about top speed. Constantly adding water if I feel any friction or the clay drying out at all. I'm using equal pressure from both hands so they cancel each other out. In other words, this hand, the meaty part of my hand where my muscles are pushing in. My right hand is pushing down with the meaty part of my hand where my muscles are. Pushing in and pushing down, using a lot more pressure than it looks like. If I use too much pressure from my right hand, this flattens out like a pancake, which I don't want. If I use too much pressure from my left hand, this gets taller, which I don't want. Equal pressure from both hands and they cancel each other out, so this maintains a little bit of a mound shape, where the most narrow part is at the top. Equal pressure from both hands, using a lot of pressure leaning in. When I think it's centered, I'm going to slowly release my pressure and my hands, keeping the wheel spinning. Cup the outside and feel if it's centered. I can tell if it's centered if my wrist is not pulsing and my elbow is not pulsing. So this feels pretty good. I'm going to knock this off center. This is not centered. If you can see, my wrists and my hands and my elbows are bouncing back and forth. So this is not centered. So I have to come back in, lean in, and push down until I feel like it's centered. Eventually, this will go much more quickly for you. To start, sometimes this can take most of class to be able to get something centered. So this feels pretty good. When I think it's centered, slowly release my pressure in my hands, check it, and this feels good. So centering is the only time I have it spinning a fast speed, as fast as I'm comfortable. From this point forward, I'm going to slow it down to about a medium speed. The second step is opening it up. It's very similar to opening it up for the cylinder. My hands are cupping the outside and they're nice and wet. I'm leaning on my legs for stability. I'm going to use my 2 thumbs, find the center, and slowly go down the center. It's going to dry out. So at some point, I'm going to carefully take my thumbs out, dribble a little water in, and continue down. Notice my fingers from my hands do not butterfly off, which is what this is. If this happens, I'm going to knock this off center, and once it's off center, it doesn't go back on center. So I keep my fingers engaged with the outside. As I get closer to the bottom, my thumbs aren't long enough, so my wrists kind of come up, my shoulders come up. As I approach the bottom, I want to stop. Now I'm going to stop the wheel, take my needle tool and pierce through the bottom and measure how thick it is. This is good. I don't want it thinner than this, which is about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch probably, because I'll trim through the bottom when I move on to the trimming stage. So this is good. Every step of the way I want to check it and make sure it's still centered. I do that by cupping it and looking at it. If right now the whole thing were bouncing around, I would know that I knocked it off center when I put my thumbs down. So far the first 2 steps are the same as a cylinder. The third step, the opening it up, is different. So with a cylinder, my hands are down here and I claw towards me and make a flat floor. I don't want to have a flat floor to my bowl. I don't want a bowl with a flat floor and rounded walls. I want to have a bowl with a continual curve on the inside. Imagine taking a spoon and dragging it across. You don't want to hit a bump anywhere. So I'm not making a floor like this, but I'm flaring this open. So this is different than the cylinders. To flare it open, my left hand is back where it was when I was centering. I'm going to use the knuckle area of these 2 fingers, and my fingertips on the inside are not touching anything. They're just kind of hanging out down here, and I'm going to lean back and flare open this rim. Arms on my legs, and I lean back, 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 back. And I flare this open until it's around the width of the base here. So maybe a little wider, maybe a little more narrow, but just about somewhere in the neighborhood of how wide this is how far I flare this open. And this looks good, still centered. If it was dancing around crazy, that would mean I knocked it off center. So now I'm gonna do my first pull, which is really kind of opening this up on the inside. If I started my pulls right now and pulled this up, this would be so narrow, and that's not what we want. We want it to be nice and open. So my first pull is using the flats of these fingers for my left hand. My thumb is down, and this hand is going to work independent first, and this hand's going to wait for it. So this hand's going to drag out, drag out, drag out, and then when it's across from this hand, they're going to sweep up and continue the pull together. So again, flats of these wet fingers, leaning on my leg, arms tucked in. This thumb is down, pushing on the wall. It's not up like this. I'm gonna slowly drag out, drag out, drag out. Now it's across from my right hand, and they're gonna pinch and sweep up together. And then when I get to the rim, I just release. So I have successfully widened that. It is no longer coming down to a point like a V. If you weren't successful with that step, if it's still very narrow in there and coming down to a V, do it again. Drag out, drag out, drag out with a lot of pressure. Then when it's across from this hand, you sweep up and complete the pull. I was successful with it. I've got a bowl shape in here. So now I'm gonna go to my the rest of my pulls. The remainder of my pulls, none of them start in the center. They start here and here on the outside. This is where the thickness of the clay is. So I'm gonna lean on my legs, arms are tucked into my body, pinch that thickness. This thumb is always down, participating in the pull. That means it's pushing against the wall. Pinch and slowly pull and sweep up. Technically, I'm using more pressure with my inside hand so this form can come out like a bowl. When we made a cylinder, it was equal pressure from both hands, so they canceled each other out, and this piece went up for a vertical form. I'm making a bowl right now, so I want to use more pressure with my inside hand, pushing out. So my inside hand kind of wins in the tug of war of the clay, and the bowl goes out. If I use too much pressure, this whole thing will flop out and collapse. So I'm gonna do one more pull because I can feel there's a little bit of extra clay down here. So I'm gonna grip onto that clay and slowly sweep up with both hands. Notice my pulls are at about 4 o'clock. With cylinders, I do it more closer to 3 o'clock, but I kind of lean back with bowls and I'm at about 4 o'clock. So this looks pretty good. I don't need to get this any thinner than it is. At this point, I could finish it up and take it off. I could also consider introducing a rib. Now, whether you use the rubber rib or not is entirely up to you. The rubber rib is tricky. Some people enjoy using it once they get used to it. Some people never enjoy it and don't use it. The rubber rib is for cleaning up the inside so I have a nice uninterrupted curve. Oftentimes, right where the floor, if there were one, and the wall meet, which would be right about here on the inside, there can be a little step there that you want to get rid of. and that would be right about here. I can use my sponge and try and work that out, or I could use the mass-produced edge of this rubber rib. When I use the rubber rib, I want to make sure everything's nice and moist, and I'm going to place this rib down kind of gently like this. I'm not going straight down because it'll chatter. I'm going to gently place it down, and I'm going to push against the wall with the sponge on the outside. I'm looking over the pot, and I can make this interior nice and as close to perfect as I can. You'll see clay will build up. I take that off, and I can turn the rib to get it to fit the pot because there's a curve all around this. So maybe I use this curve, maybe I use this curve, however it works in your bowl. The key to the rubber rib is not crossing over the center. What I mean by that is the wheel is spinning this way over here. If when I use this rib, I cross over the center to this side, it'll catch it and tear up the bottom of my bowl. So I'm always staying to the right of center. Otherwise, I'll tear up the bottom of my bowl. And you're very careful when you get to the center. If you see a little kind of nipple form in the center, better to use your sponge to erase that and compress it away than try and do that with the rib. So staying away from the center with the rib is a good idea. So once I think that I'm done, I could call this done. My interior is a nice interior. There are no bumps down there. I could also play with the rim a little bit. You could throw this exact bowl 20 different times and just change the rim, and it can be 20 different bowls. So for example, I could take 2 wet index fingers. One's going to go underneath at 6 o'clock. One's going to come up here, and I can create a flared rim. And a flared rim, the further my finger goes down, the more flare or the more of a rim I have. I never push past the halfway point because it will flop. But a flared rim is a nice way to introduce decoration, which some of your pieces you have to do. So this could set up a nice spot for carving or slip trailing or slip painting. I can visually sharpen that rim, supporting the outside using the flat side of this rib. And this just gives it a little bit more precision. So you can do things like this if you'd like, or you could just leave it how it was before. So now that I'm done, I'm going to remove this. I soak up any moisture that is built up on the bottom. Water on the bottom can cause a crack. I'm going to use my wooden knife, angled side, and I'm going to put this on the wheel head and push it in to give it a little spot for my wire tool. Use my 2 thumbs, push down and away, and release my splash pan. I'm going to flood the wheel head with water. Get my board, and get this wet, line it up, undercut this first, and push it off. You want to be careful when you push off your bowls. Bowls are more prone to warping because they're flared out. So you really want to make sure that it slides with ease. I'm going to cut this in half so we can look at it. So I'm not going to slide it off. And what I want to show you is that once we trim this, the outside of it will become a little bit more bowl-like because I will trim away all this extra clay. So all this will go away, all this will go away, and all this will go away. So your bowls, as you're throwing them, they're always going to be thicker on the bottom, and most likely your bowls will look a little bit more bowl-like on the inside than the outside. The outside, when you trim it, it becomes a little bit more bowl-like. So trimming these makes a big impact on the outside profile of the bowl. Lastly, for an example, this bisqued bowl, when this was thrown, it was probably straight down from here down. So it curved and then went straight down. And then when this was turned over and trimmed, the bottom quarter or third of this bowl becomes much more rounded. Because if you throw it like a perfect bowl on the inside and the outside, it's much more likely to flop while you're throwing it. So it's always going to be a little thicker. So when you've thrown your bowls, if you look at the inside and say it looks great, and then you look at the outside and say it doesn't really look like a bowl, especially on the bottom, that bowl will come to once you trim it. Good luck.